We are shifting gears this afternoon to something that's impossible to ignore right now, the geopolitical and regulatory environment and what it actually means for the businesses in this room. Please welcome to the stage our moderator, Jim Gatta, partner at Goodwin, and our panelists, Scott Friedman, VP of Government Affairs at Altana, Drew DeLong, Head of Corporate Statecraft at Kearney, Clay Porter, co-founder of Arcturus, and Brooke Berg, Director of the Mintz Group. This session is presented by Goodwin.
Thank you. Don't applaud yet. Thank you, and I'm Jim Gatta, and I am partner at Goodwin here in New York, where I work on government investigations and enforcement and white-collar defense issues, often in the tech space, and very often these days in and around supply chains and procurement. So we're going to talk about some of those issues this afternoon. We have a great panel, but I want to frame our discussion a little bit to start. I think everyone realizes that we are operating in a fundamentally different global trade environment than we were at the beginning of 2025. Geopolitical tensions, including in key international passageways like the Strait of Hormuz and others, are no longer presenting logistics problems. They are shaping how companies and their investors have to think about compliance risk and enforcement exposure. And at the same time, U.S. law enforcement and regulatory agencies, as well as those in the UK, EU, Asia Pacific, and elsewhere, are treating trade, customs, sanctions, and export controls as interconnected tools of national security policy. And what's clear is that supply chain decisions that once looked operational or even administrative are now frequently enforcement decisions. So we're going to examine these enforcement risks and considerations in this discussion with some experts and leaders in the field. And I'm going to introduce them to you. I'll start to my left. Brooke Berg is a director at the Mintz Group within its disputes practice, where Brooke specializes in threat and reputation management for companies and executives, family offices and their assets, as well as in investigations and enforcement matters, and corporate risk mitigation and compliance reviews. Prior to her time at Mintz, Brooke worked in Silicon Valley, assisting startups with developing AI-enabled national security tools, and she previously served as an operations officer at the Central Intelligence Agency, where she was deployed overseas for many years. To Brooke's left is Scott Friedman. He is a vice president of government affairs at Altana, where he directs the company's legislative and regulatory strategy through strong relationships with U.S. and international government agencies. Before joining Altana, Scott served as senior policy advisor on the House Committee on Homeland Security, advising on geopolitical threats, matters of trade enforcement, and cyber policy. He founded and led the Office of Trade and Economic Security at the Department of Homeland Security, where he was an acting assistant secretary of Homeland Security, where he also served on critical national security bodies, including on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, and Team Telecom. Scott was a senior policy advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, where he helped develop strategies to protect the nation's critical cyber and infrastructure assets. Earlier in his career, he worked in the private sector as part of Deloitte's supply chain practice and began his career in the United States Army's 82nd Airborne Division. Drew DeLong is a principal and head of corporate statecraft at Kearney. Drew helps organizations tackle challenges ranging from geopolitical instability and government affairs to corporate strategy, restructuring, and acquisitions across more than 15 industries. Drew supports clients in identifying, prioritizing, and responding to geopolitical headwinds that impact their businesses at the intersection of national security and private sector challenges across all industries. Earlier in his career, he served as an aide for the Director of Policy Planning for the United States Secretary of State and held roles at the United States Congress, in federal agencies, and at the White House. And last but certainly not least is Clay Porter. He is the co-founder and partner at Arcturus PLLC, where he advises and represents clients, including individuals and organizations, in white-collar and criminal and regulatory matters, internal investigations, asset recovery, and compliance counseling, focusing on a number of things, including U.S. economic sanctions, the Bank Secrecy Act, and anti-money laundering laws and regulations, international money laundering and corruption, and cryptocurrency. For many years, Clay was a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he was the the Principal Deputy Chief of the DOJ Criminal Division's Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, and the Chief of its Bank Integrity Unit. There, Clay managed a wide variety of complex domestic and internal investigations focused on the Bank Secrecy Act and money laundering, fraud, U.S. economic sanctions enforcement, and coordinated all those efforts with various U.S. state and federal and foreign law enforcement and regulators around the globe, including OFAC, the Federal Reserve, OCC, the United Kingdom's FCA, and Crown Prosecution Service, among many others. And he is a proud son of Virginia. So we're going to start. Drew, if I could turn it first to you. There is no doubt that we are living in an ever-shifting geopolitical environment. Could you set the stage for us as we start to consider enforcement risks for companies?
Yeah, happy to, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having all of us and to everybody else up here and sharing the stage with us. I think the moment in time that we're at is one that if you're a business leader in the room, you're tired of hearing the words persistent uncertainty, right? We're tired of talking about tariffs, or right before we jumped up on stage, it was, does anybody check the news in the last 15 minutes for updates out of the China summit? And that's this state of permanent glued to our screens of what is the latest development, how is it impacting our business, how is it impacting our customers, what email am I going to get from my boss saying, does this matter to us, what do we do? And what's causing that? And I think several things, but if we're not all careful, it's easy to go down one path and not view them as an interconnected web of systems. When this administration came into office, they did not mince words about what their intent was. We go back to December 2023, New York Times ran an article around the Trump 2025 trade agenda. And in that article, again, it was about Christmas Day in 2023, there was 60% tariffs on China, 10% universal tariff, and a 4-year mandated phase-out ban of Chinese steel, pharmaceuticals, and technology products. Fast forward to the last 16 months, we've now seen reciprocal tariffs broadly spanned out. We've seen the introduction of fentanyl tariffs. We've seen a huge expansion of Section 232 tariffs, where the first Trump administration used them twice this time around. I think an aggregate of rolled out and investigation, I think we're at 15, more or less. But we're also seeing other trade tools come now into effect. And whether that be implementing actual direct deals with companies, MP Materials, direct equity stakes with Intel, setting in price floors, expanding export controls in some domains, putting a gating toll booth on other export controls in other domains. There is an entire web now of economic statecraft that is being deployed by this administration, and they are not mincing words about why they're doing it. I think in some senses they're being a little bit modest. They're trying to not be inflammatory, especially when on the other side of the Pacific there is a competitor who has shown the willingness and the ability to leverage their own choke points with critical minerals and contested access on things that are fundamentally critical to our infrastructure. And when I look at the broader ecosystem, it reminds me of a historical parallel where if we go back in time to the end of the Soviet era, perestroika was fundamentally an attempt by Gorbachev to open up a system for the sake of survival. But what we're in now almost is a reverse perestroika moment where we're starting to see closer intersection between government, between company, as an attempt to protect U.S. hegemonic leadership. And what that means for businesses broadly across sectors, whether you're making goods, whether you're in software services, is this environment is not going to change. If we look at the continuity on the trade environment and the enforcement environment from the first Trump administration to the Biden administration to now, there's been continuity. The tariffs didn't go away. If anything, the authorities within BIS and the export controls and this discussion of small yard, high fence, and all these other things that we're going to hear about today in spades didn't go away. They sped up significantly. And I don't think this is a Trump symptom. I think this is a symptom of the environment that we're in, the symptom of great power competition and a recognition that after 40 years of globalization, there is now a competition that is actively being fought out. We're seeing this in some of the posturing of that last night coming out of Beijing. We'll continue to see it tonight as well. But as we set the context for the discussion today, think about, as a business leader, you may not be interested in government, but government is already interested in you, and asking what does that mean for us from an opportunity standpoint if we think about what is the best possible upside in that environment, but also thinking about what is the worst possible case, what's the worst thing that we can do, what is the worst thing that governments can do to us, and putting your corporate strategies in the business and operational actions that you take in context of that.
Thanks, Drew. We're gonna start the enforcement-focused discussion where you were left off with respect to tariffs and the intersection of trade policy, tariffs, and customs enforcement. The enforcement of tariffs, Clay, and other duties have been a focus of the administration, as Drew mentioned, via both civil and criminal means. And this is where the U.S. is making a clear statement that trade fraud is not solely an administrative issue. Can you explain for us the United States Department of Justice's efforts in this area?
Sure, and thanks everyone for hearing us. And by the way, that's a bit scary to me that they're interested in, that the government's interested in business. We'll go back to that, I hope, because I think it's a really important point.
I'm from the government, I'm here to help.
Yeah, exactly. I'll take it for granted that folks know about the Trade Fraud Task Force, the origins, the executive orders, and all of these sorts of things for a moment. What I would say, though, is that, and by the way, that's not a new typology. The enforcement measures have been taking place for years. Now it's a priority, and priorities change versus by administration. That's no different. But for supply chain participants, I think what's really important and what we're seeing is that the DOJ's efforts around enforcement is a real combination of data analytics, VSDs, and whistleblowers. And when you have all three of those together, that can create a really scary environment. And that's what our clients are seeing right now. And I think for us, and this is actually quite not new, but it's happening more and more, we're seeing competitors of our clients go in to the Department of Justice and make presentations saying, for example, one of our clients is violating tariffs, and this is how they're doing it. They do it either through sometimes through the FCA process, right? Make an FCA claim. They develop whistleblowers.
Clay, I'm going to ask you to break down some of these terms you're using. So you referred to VSD.
So voluntary self-disclosures, like people going in and saying, hey, mea culpa, I screwed up here, can take it easy on me. Which we'll get to in a bit because it's not quite as simple as that. But there are folks that are coming in with voluntary self-disclosure efforts. Whistleblowers, who are folks, some are actually, are really have real claims and are legitimate folks coming in and saying there's a crime taking place in my business and I want to report on that. And then, of course, data analytics, where the people are looking at both public and privately available information. We have some clients who actually scrape and are able to scrape the internet for all kinds of information around tariffs and what their competitors are doing. And so all of that comes to the what we're seeing is it's created in sort of a frenzied environment a little bit in this area where you have competitors worried about their competitors going in and reporting on them. So they're going to be looking at what their competitors are doing, and you'll have sometimes, and I actually spoke to a DOJ person about this last week, they had someone come in, two people come in, reporting on each other. And so the takeaway for that, in our view, is you just have to be very, very vigilant around what's happening on the ground, what's happening in your shop, what's happening at the port, what's happening in the logistics center, because that's where all that data first is created, and that's where you get the whistleblowers.
So you referenced, Clay, that at the outset of your remarks, the Trade Task Force, and that's an interagency effort that involves the Department of Homeland Security as well as DOJ and other partners. But the main agencies that are at the forefront of this are DHS, where Scott used to work, and DOJ, where you and I used to work. Scott, these kind of interagency efforts are not new. This is, as mentioned, they've been going on for a long time. You were certainly involved in many when you were at Homeland, but are there things that you're seeing that are different this time around with how they're approaching it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think as properly alluded to, some things change and some things stay the same. And so the mechanisms of government, how government goes about executing the priorities of an administration or geopolitical priorities or priorities acting in the interests of a nation, they do change. And so we are seeing, these systems now be pointed at new priorities. I think what is novel and what is very different is that we are now approaching very complicated matters that had essentially never been considered at this level of granularity because the overarching system by which they existed in has completely changed. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by this is that we enjoyed essentially 25 years of status quo as it pertained to global commerce. And so within that system, there was a lot of things that were the Wild West, and there were broad structures through organizations like the WTO, the WCO, where there were legal mechanisms for conflict resolution and arbitration and all kinds of kind of Western legal-based activities. And that simultaneous ambiguity and relative systematic approach benefited everybody because everybody was making money. Well, as kind of Drew alluded to, that whole system is fractured. And so the geopolitical aims of that system are now changing in a way where government agencies are going to have to get a hell of a lot better about how they execute these authorities. And so what we are seeing right now is a legacy process having to materially evolve rapidly in an age of complexity. And I think, frankly, this is a data problem. This is a big data problem. AI, God bless AI, our panel before, will fix a lot of this. But there is going to be a very painful period that we're experiencing right now where the government is going to have to figure out how it evolves its processes, the private sector is going to figure out how it evolves its processes, and then there is going to have to be a reorientation about how those two sides are going to work with one another. And then you consider that in the context of domestic commercial activity, international commercial activity, and geopolitical overlay. We're very much in kind of a 4D chess situation.
It's funny when you talk about the government having to catch up. I think there are a lot of people who think that the federal government in the U.S. has just this sort of unchecked, untold resources, right? And all of us served in the government in different places, and I think we probably all have our own stories of saying, where is that room like they have on NCIS, where the smart lady with the horn rimmed glasses just sort of types some stuff and finds the bad guy? And it was probably at Langley, right, Brooke? But
it definitively is not.
Clay, if I could just ask you maybe just to give folks a flavor of some of the kinds of matters that the government has been recently sort of focused on, in terms of like how the customs and trade sort of enforcement has played itself out. Not super long, but just to give folks some ideas.
You're talking about the schemes, like
exactly.
The manipulation of country of origins, the reclassification of goods, misclassification of goods.
Like lying about where things are coming from.
Yeah,
where
double invoicing, which, by the way, and we were talking about this earlier, which also bleeds into trade-based money laundering, which is a very significant part of all of this without it being written. We will talk about that in a moment, but also, of course, product safety violations. And one of the things we've noticed very quickly is, and we've got some clients around this, where there are some sort of technology that is one thing when it's put together, but then folks are taking it apart so that it's not classified a certain way, and then when they get it on shore, they then put it back together and then send it on.
Yeah.
That's a big one that we're seeing.
Yeah. So both you and Scott have talked about whistleblowers, you talked about people being encouraged to come to the government, whether they be competitors or whether they be folks inside companies. You've talked about data and sort of how data is driving this reporting and the government's sort of assessment of these things. Brooke, as an investigations professional, How are you seeing these things play out in real time?
Yeah, I mean, I'm laughing because when Clay was talking about that situation where it's, two competitors ratting each other out, I'm like, oh my God, it's amazing for business, right? For our business. With this administration, we saw that FCPA work, just, corruption work just absolutely dried up completely. And what has taken its place, because of these changes that we're discussing, where, before customs fraud used to be primarily a civil concern, and now we're talking about it being a criminal concern, and the role that whistleblowers are playing, we're getting tons of work from competitors who are saying, this guy over here, he's underselling me, and I think there's something going on. And that has now begun to form a big basis of the work that we are doing, and that is fundamentally owing to geopolitical changes that are so far beyond small manufacturing firms in the Midwest, right? And, customs fraud used to be primarily like an opportunistic sort of crime, but I think one of the big changes that has taken place, because we're talking about this geostrategic challenge that we, the United States, are experiencing with China, is that, what used to be this sort of opportunistic, mostly low-level sort of crime has now become, if not state-run, it is at least a state-tolerated system that is very much akin to what to what I used to do when I was in the CIA, and we were tracking, say, dual-use weapons materials, all over the world. And it's all of the things that Clay just articulated. It's, layered business structures. And you'll knock down one business and 10 pop up in its place. It's, transshipment is a huge piece. And then it definitely, changing the model of manufacturing goods so that they arrive in two pieces as opposed to one piece, and slapping a Made in the USA sticker on it and calling it a day. I mean, those sorts of behaviors are now becoming, I think, much more widespread.
I want to, because our time is shorter than I think, where we have stuff to say for. I want to move on to exports and export controls and sanctions. But before I do this, given all of everything we've just talked about in the trade environment, Scott, when talking to companies that are either managing their own supply chains or supporting supply chains, how are you advising folks to manage these risks?
Yeah, I mean, Brooke kind of hit on it. All of these very nuanced elements of international trade that were largely innocuous previously, and transshipment is a great example. There is legal transshipment. There are legal definitions for substantial transformation, which is how a good becomes, moves up the value chain. And those rules are moving very quickly. And so the thing that we talk about all the time is that the reality is you as an end user, as an importer or as an OEM, or maybe even as a tier one, you need to know your entire extended value chain at this point. You are on the hook for who's making it, where it's coming from, where it's passing through, who they're doing business with. There's a litany of good historic case law for this around trade-based money laundering, terrorist financing, all these things that are now really standing in as the analogs for what's going to be trade-based economic statecraft and economic security enforcement. And so visibility, doing the diligence, getting in there, and then being able to create an enduring and flexible system that you can use for a whole host of requirements today, but that will be extensible for whatever comes next, because it's certainly coming next. And the last thing I'll say about this is that this is not just a U.S. situation. Yeah. The Europeans are doing this, the Chinese are doing this, the middle powers are doing this, the Gulf countries are doing this. These types of shaped regulations, these type shapes concerns are global, and they are regional, and they are not all harmonized.
Drew, you mentioned in your opening remarks, you referenced sanctions and export controls, and this is obviously another area where enforcement has been there. A bunch of years ago, at the beginning of the Biden administration, the then Deputy Attorney General, I remember made a point to say that sanctions was the new FCPA. So sanctions enforcement has been an issue for years now, but we're seeing it turn maybe even a little more aggressive, more coordinated, and more extraterritorial. From your vantage point, Drew, how are export controls and sanctions regimes being leveraged for geopolitical advantage or to express national priorities?
From my immediate vantage point, I think they're two separate, they're a bit of a Venn diagram between the two, but I think you can absolutely take them each apart. On export controls, what I've seen in my own view is it is completely tied at the hip on the AI issue. And with the fundamental thesis of how do we as a country stay ahead of our next closest competitor, at minimum one generation, if not multiple. With AI effectively being the unique element of that technology being different from all other previous because it builds on top of each other. One generation ahead means your R&D is further ahead. It means new drug research is further ahead. It means new weapon systems are further ahead. And so having just a little bit further of a gap means so much more than before. It's not just, okay, we've now gone from sticks and stones to steel, or now everybody has a coal furnace. What does that do for industrial capacity? This is a compounding effect. And so I think there's a battle that's happening, one over who gets access to that. If I look at the competing AI action plans of the US and China with Pax Silica and then the Digital Silk Road, I don't think it's an accident whatsoever that last July, China announced their AI action plan within a week of the US's. And you look at what China's trying to do right now by having and building their own self-sufficient technology stack, really across the board. They have a huge majority of leadership in mature node semiconductor manufacturing, and it is increasing, but they're also now trying to replicate their own technologies on the leading edge as well that are significantly behind ours, but they're catching up. And some of the breakthroughs of the last 24 months on things like the new Huawei phone, which was done on a very, very inefficient semiconductor process that doesn't compete with ours, but they still got there. And they're trying to do these things now on things like EUV technology to be able to make the chips on lithography. All of these things come back to a fundamental competition of them trying to catch up, them trying to be self-sufficient, and the U.S. saying, okay, well, do not leech off of our technology leadership, and we're not going to help you do that. Now, that may seem at ends or at odds with things like a 25% export tax on select NVIDIA and AMD chips. But then on the other side, you have state actors saying, well, don't accept those chips. We want to use our chips. And so there's a battle over export controls that's happening. I think on the sanction side, I know people will disagree with me on this. I think there's a competition of thought of, one, how effective are they? And two, well, what does that mean for pushing other middle powers, Gulf states, other countries who are considering the currencies that they do transactions with when there's another party trying to push for an alternative mechanism? I think they're two separate topics, but they still speak to the same kind of geostrategic competition, and it's just more of the same.
Okay, I'm not just going to put one pin in that. I'm going to put two. One on the sanctions for a little bit, and two on the specific China piece. But I want to ask you, Drew, is there a tension for U.S. companies where you're talking about an environment where we want to be, and the administration has said this, their actions have sort of demonstrated this. We want to be a laboratory for AI, for the without much regulation. But then you have a control technology, export control regime, that is often changing. How are you advising companies to sort of manage that, to be both disruptive inventor and handler of potentially controlled technology?
Well, that question frames out one of the battles of our time. I think the underlying thread on that is I hope there's not a fire alarm. I think underneath that, and I thought it was interesting, I said 40 years, Scott said 25, but for whatever duration of time that we have enjoyed open, efficiency-first markets, our tech stacks have catered to differentiation at each level, where each piece within the chain has become ultra-specialized in whatever the geographic advantages that allowed it to become that. whether that be ASML in the Netherlands, whether that be the semiconductor gases that are coming out of Japan, whether that be the frontier labs that we see in Silicon Valley. If you just go down, let's take just only AI, but this is the case for really everything on the cutting edge. But if you go down those value chains, there are specific points of exceptional performance that are all differentiated at each part. What we're moving into now is a domain where there are going to become duplicative tech stacks. When you have the Europeans saying we're going to have a semiconductor ecosystem, and the US pouring billions into having a semiconductor ecosystem, and China doing that, and guess what? India is doing the exact same thing. Well, then what happens when instead of one efficient layer, now just pick one layer and there's 3 or 4 different ones across? This is going to continue to permeate outside of AI, outside of semiconductors. Pick your leading industry. And when I think about what you have to do within that domain, if you're a company, differentiation, what makes you different? What makes you the core piece? If there is a duplicative tech stack today, what makes you the sole point that, sure, there may be some distractions, but what is, when people think about that one specific part of the chain, they think about you. When we think about lithography, we think about ASML. Why? Because they're differentiated, because they have best-in-class technology, because it allows us to do things that are mind-blowing, like the fact that we can all go on Claude right now and look up God knows what and solve problems on our phone in minutes. Differentiation unlocks stability in this environment, and I think that's going to continue.
Can I actually say 2 words about that? I apologize. So I would also encourage folks to think about this. I think especially in this country, we think about, well, differentiation and competition is best-in-class, bleeding-edge frontier technology. I just came from Exponential the last 2 days in Detroit, which is the biggest autonomous vehicle expo in North America. There is hundreds of companies that are trying to differentiate on safe, reliant, available technology that is totally commoditized in other parts of the world. So there is innovation and there is leadership to be had in this kind of duplicative tech stack concept that Drew sets up that has nothing to do with ones and zeros and what we're building in software. It has a lot to do with there are real considerations about availability, trust, and capacity to innovate in a sovereign environment over the long term in things that we would otherwise think are boring, commoditized, low value, and we don't do here in the United States. That's very much changing, and that's true for a whole host of sectors.
Completely agree.
Brooke, the government's emphasis, right, on export control enforcement, how are you seeing that play out sort of in your practice and investigations work for companies trying to grapple with the environment?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is where we take what used to be strictly intelligence organization tradecraft and just sort of like lift and shift it onto a technology model, right? And I mean, frankly, I think one of the things that you were highlighting is there is some question as to the efficacy of these export controls and how significant they actually are to addressing the concerns that we have. So first, talking about the supply chains, right? This is where you have third country intermediaries who are more than willing to make a buck, ensuring that countries like China have access to semiconductors. That said, I would really question whether or not that has even mattered, because in some ways we have almost had the opposite effect, I think, that we intended to have with these export controls, where it's like we have created the exact market conditions that have pushed China to a position of having to, of being more creative and catching up to us in ways that expend less energy and require less investment and less financial investment, less energy investment. And what do I mean by that? Here in the US, I think we've just been so focused on the idea of parameters and parameters and parameters, and we're gonna make the biggest, baddest T-Rex of an AI that we possibly can. And because the Chinese don't have access to this, incredible technology, they have instead pursued a strategy of focusing on the use cases, the utilization of AI. And so they have specialized where we have tried to generalize. And when you actually look side by side at algorithmic performance, we're talking like the gap between what we're doing here in the US with huge, resources and what China is doing with much smaller resources is extremely small when it comes to performance on specific tasks. So, I guess in some, there is this, very exotic layered network in place to go around these, export control choke points, and it's not really that effective at the end of the day.
Two quick thoughts on that. One, she's spot on. Just full transparency, we tried to kill Huawei, we did.
No, they just got more agile, they got stronger, they got more creative.
Completely.
And we pushed them there.
Completely. And on top of that, my natural tendency when we bring these topics up is I want to have a discussion on AI now. Should we generalize? Should we specialize? How do we get better use cases? How do we stop just, doing the wrong things and start to accelerate and use this amazing technology? But I frame that out because the line between AI and geopolitics, you cannot have one conversation without the other. They are completely blended in this moment where just as this is a profound geopolitical moment in history, it is probably, we're in the middle of one of the biggest economic experiments of our lifetime. At the exact same time as one of the biggest technological moments of our lifetime. And you cannot pull them apart.
The only thing, just a quick thing is that, but all of this goes back to your original point, though, is that it seems like the government is trying to pick sides and pick who they want to win. And that's anathema to how we were able to build all our technology throughout the years. We have a robust crypto practice in my firm, robust, emerging tech. We're very deep into distributed ledgers. And the government for years tried to keep their thumb on development of technology, right? We're also seeing now, when the government let it wide open, that there's all kinds of things that aren't going well either in that context. So, from my perspective, what we're seeing is when the government does pick favorites and does get involved, it creates an environment that people feel as if they can do anything they want at times.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that also frames out a really kind of scary question that I don't think anyone has the ultra concise answer to this.
Have you asked Claude?
No, we can't.
Just throwing it out there.
It'll probably hallucinate because the new models are in it. But if you buy the assumption that we are in a great power competition, which I think everyone on this panel will agree with, and we're competing against a state actor who openly coordinates their industry, whether it's around overcapacity, whether it's willingness to lose money. My team in the back, who I love dearly, just did some research last night, and they showed me China's reported, so caveat on that, PPI went negative for 40 months. If that happened here, the sky would be falling. And so if that's what we're up against, if we're up against the willingness to lose money, to accept state coordination, to accept the leverage that they're willing to put on the system, trading your supply chain data for critical mineral access, then yes, completely agreed, the American way of doing business as before, this is a different model. But what is the right model? What is the right balance to keep the inherently American way, but also the American way that wins? Yeah. And I think that is a very difficult question that I don't think we're having openly.
This is the key point. I mean, Clay, you hit on it, right? But America needs to figure out what it wants to be in the world and what the position we're going to play is. And when, historically speaking, USG in particular has been able to set the rules of the game, the private market has excelled in figuring out how to optimize for that. In the case of a geopolitical competitor, which we've not experienced since World War II, where we were a very different country, we have not figured out what our posture is domestically or abroad, and we're going to have to figure that out in a hurry. Because the U.S. financial system, specifically many of you here, has optimized for short-term gain. And a lot of us has gotten very wealthy doing it, and congratulations to us, except our competitor doesn't think like that. And if we keep building in cycles of, I can exit in 5, 7, 10 years, and I'm looking for multiples that hit 10, 20, 50, 100, 1,000x, we are going to continuously optimize for the wrong things. Because our, not only geopolitical adversary anymore, because that's really not even the conversation. Every single person here in this room has a international competitor now. Every one of you, whether you know it or not. And the difference now is that in the markets that you want to sell to, whether that be the United States or third markets, and I don't care what happens today, China's not going to be an option for any of you, any of us. We're going to be head-to-head with a state-backed, well-funded, well-capitalized, well-resourced commercial adversary. And that's the challenge I think we really face.
There were a lot of topics that we might have to take up in the lobby. But in the moments that we have left, are there any questions that folks want to ask the panel? I have some, in case you don't.
We've scared them. We've scared them into silence.
Yeah. I mean, we tend to have that effect.
No, right?
But it's kind of my lot in life.
For what it's worth, I still think we got the best hand. So I love companies. I still think we got the best hand.
Yeah.
We just got to change perspective.
All right, we've got companies and investors, in the room. Let's go down the line. Brooke, what's a takeaway that you want to leave folks with from this discussion?
Oh man, I would just say ignorance is not going to be a defense to not understanding your supply chain. And the amount of work now that it takes to ensure that your supply chain is compliant is much greater, I think, than it ever used to be. It is much more complex. And I think to genuinely have any sense of safety and security in an environment where we have gone from civil to criminal considerations, it is going to require you to do a kind of due diligence that you have not previously experienced. And that due diligence, I think, necessarily needs to involve a wide variety of tools, not just public records and online tools, but human sources. You need to be bringing AI. And then I can't remember who it was that said, it might have been Drew, that the key to this is not just setting it up one time, but in fact building a system that continues over time and that is stable over time.
Scott.
Yeah, what I would say is, listen, a lot more is going to be asked of this group in terms of disclosure, in terms of making hard business decisions, in terms of doing things that maybe previously, from a fiduciary standpoint, were tough to justify. But you're going to be asked to do it in the name of long-term success and harmonizing into this picture of whatever it becomes. And what I would say is ask for stuff back. If the USG is going to require this of you, say, hey, you need to evolve too. I need to be able to disclose easier. I need to be able to have a more transparent conversation with you. I need to have a conduit that's responsive and is going to be able to support me in the ways that you're asking me to do something. So, seek out government, because Drew aptly put it. I mean, you are all on the field. We're all out there together. We got to make this government work for us so that we can unleash the unique capabilities that is American innovation and capitalism.
True.
I've said a lot. I feel like I've been the most negative one on the stage. So I'm going to try to end on a happy note.
That's quite the competition.
So I'm going to try to end on a happy note. One, as you think about your organizations in the room, if you don't know today who is responsible, who owns this topic in your organization, if you are getting all of your news and intelligence to the business, go designate somebody by the end of the day today. Have somebody or somebodies whose job it is to track, to put and contextualize the information that they're getting into the business context for you, because nobody knows your business more than you. And to ask the questions and to force the dialogue of where can we go on offense? Can we be proactive about where we go on defense? Do that today. Secondly, don't just view this environment as doom and gloom, which is really easy to do. There is an immense amount of opportunity in this environment. And I would say fight the tendency to avoid the fear, the FUD, and go on offense. Win the differentiation battle, because you can. And I completely agree with Scott. We are competing globally. We are in this unique moment. Be a solution and absolutely take advantage of every single benefit that comes from that. And on the investment case side, bake in geopolitical premiums into your multiples. I love what Scott said about, is it 5, 10, 100, 1,000x. One of the most interesting phenomenon I've seen in the financial services space in the last 12 months is there are national security leaders now that are leading in-house national security teams and really applied government affairs teams within major banks, within major private equity firms, because they are doing this. So if you're building in a business case or a business thesis, ask yourself the question of, okay, given the environments that we may be in over the course of while we take this position, is this potential to significantly expand our multiple, or is this a situation where we could see it go significantly down given this environment? Don't make a geopolitically agnostic decision.
15 seconds, Clay?
Yeah, after that, what am I going to say? I mean, that was terrific. I'll be very granular about cases that we're dealing with ourselves in the enforcement world. U.S. executives of foreign companies who intersect with high-risk jurisdictions, you need to make sure the guardrails are in place, that they're not inadvertently or otherwise crossing into a sanctions violation. OFAC is looking for this right now. AI, everybody says, we all know it's extraordinary and it's helpful. We use it in our firm, our clients use it. But what's really important, and what we're seeing in the enforcement world, particularly in supply chain, if you've got AI focused on your due diligence, test it, because you will get fake invoices. You will find yourself to be involved inadvertently in factoring schemes. Be very careful. And third, outsourcing compliance. You can outsource the compliance, but you can't outsource the liability. OFAC is looking right now, actively looking right now at third-party compliance providers. So if you've got them, you need to test them and make sure that they work in your risk appetite and they match your risk management systems.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you all very, very much. This was great. Appreciate it.